Families are meant to protect, but tonight we explore 5 true crime cases where blood turned deadly. Tonight's volume focuses on 5 haunting real-life stories in which family bonds collapsed into betrayal, from the disturbing case of James Mervin Nibbe to the shocking murder of Rachel O'Reilly, the heartbreaking tragedy of Brooklyn Sims, the brutal killing of Colby Vinson, and the chilling case of Mary Ellen Samuels. Each story reveals how trust can fracture and love can turn lethal. Welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. If this is your first time here, feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. And if you enjoy these carefully researched stories, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future volumes. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that these stories involve real people and real tragedies. They are shared not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and raise awareness of warning signs that could help prevent similar outcomes. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume slightly, just enough to let the narration guide you into rest. Please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the quiet heartland of Minnesota, a place where cornfields stretch to the horizon and neighbors know each other by name. This is a story about trust and betrayal, about secrets hidden behind closed doors, and about a young man whose life ended far too soon. Let the gentle rhythm of this narrative carry you toward rest, as we explore the story of James Mervin Nibbe. In the southwestern corner of Minnesota, nestled among farmland and pristine lakes, sits the small city of Lake Crystal. In 2010, it was home to about 2,500 souls, the kind of place where high school football games drew crowds and everyone showed up for the county fair. Crystal Lake itself sparkled at the center of town, its shores dotted with fishing piers and public landings where families spent summer evenings. The town had been there since 1869, when the railroad came through and settlers claimed their piece of the prairie. Over the decades, it had grown slowly, steadily, becoming the sort of community where people raised their children, worked hard, and trusted their neighbors. On the outskirts of Lake Crystal, down a gravel road lined with cornfields, stood a modest home. The address was 5127 176th Street, though most people would have just called it the Nibbe place. James Mervin Nibbe was born on October 30th, 1983, in Mankato, not far from Lake Crystal. His parents, Mervin and Karen, raised him and his siblings in Vernon Center, teaching them the values that rural Minnesota holds dear. Work hard, be honest, help your neighbors. Friends and family called him Jim. He grew up loving the outdoors, spending his free time fishing the local lakes and hunting in the autumn woods. He joined the FFA in high school, became active in Ducks Unlimited and the Garden City Rod and Gun Club. These weren't just hobbies for Jim. They were who he was. He graduated from Lake Crystal Welcome Memorial High School in 2002, a young man with a bright future and a solid work ethic. While still in school, he'd worked as a handyman for a local couple, Hank and Jan Roloffs, learning the value of craftsmanship and honest labor. After high school, he attended Minnesota West Community College, where he trained to become an electrician. By October 2005, Jim had found his calling. He was hired as an apprentice electrician at Maple River Electric, working his way through the certification process, earning respect from his colleagues and supervisors alike. He was 26 years old, strong and capable, with calloused hands and a ready smile. Those who knew Jim described him as a good man. Quiet, dependable, kind, the sort of person you could count on. Jennifer Lee Gilman was born in 1977, 6 years before Jim. She too had grown up in rural Minnesota, and those who knew her in high school remembered her as striking, popular, the kind of girl who could move easily between different social circles. But Jennifer's path hadn't been easy. At 16, while still a senior in high school, she became pregnant. Many young women in her situation might have felt overwhelmed, lost, uncertain of the future. But Jennifer's family rallied around her. They encouraged her, supported her, told her she could do this, and she did. She kept her son, Brady, and raised him while finishing her education. Determined to provide for her child, she enrolled in nursing school and worked her way through the program, eventually securing a full-time position at a local surgery center. She bought a home on her own, purchased land, built a life for herself and Brady in Blue Earth County. By all outward appearances, Jennifer was the very definition of resilience. A single mother who had overcome teenage pregnancy, earned her nursing license, and created stability for her family. Her sister Angela later described Jennifer as strong-willed, someone who did things her own way. When Jennifer made a decision, she stuck to it. Jim and Jennifer's paths crossed in the way many couples meet in small towns. Through chance, through community, through the web of connections that bind rural life together. Jim had a younger brother named Jason, and Jason had a girlfriend who was diabetic. One day, the girlfriend went into diabetic shock. Jim discovered her and immediately called 911. When the ambulance arrived, Jennifer Gilman was on the crew. It's easy to imagine how it might have unfolded. Jim, concerned and focused, trying to help someone in crisis. Jennifer, professional and calm, doing her job. Perhaps they exchanged a few words afterward. Perhaps Jim called to check on Jason's girlfriend, and Jennifer answered. Perhaps in a town as small as Lake Crystal, they simply kept running into each other. However it happened, they started dating. And on May 24th, 2008, Jim Nibbe and Jennifer Gilman were married. Jim was 24. Jennifer was 31. He gained not just a wife, but a stepson in Brady, Jennifer's teenage boy. They settled into the house on 176th Street, surrounded by farmland, living the quiet life that both had known since childhood. To those on the outside, they seemed content. Jim continued working as an apprentice electrician, putting in long hours, building toward his future certification. Jennifer kept her job at the surgery center, caring for patients before and after their procedures. But beneath the surface, something was beginning to fracture. What no one knew, what Jim himself might not have fully understood, was that Jennifer was carrying secrets, heavy ones. The kind that grow heavier with each passing day. She had developed an addiction to prescription pills. Not just a casual dependence, but a consuming need that shaped her entire existence. Tramadol, opiates, anything she could get her hands on. She was taking between 100 and 180 pills per day. The quantities are difficult to comprehend. 100 pills, 150, 180, each day a desperate search for the next fix, the next moment of relief. And Jennifer was a nurse. She had access. She began stealing prescription pads from her workplace, forging prescriptions in doctors' names, obtaining medications through the mail. She stole pills directly from her patients, people who trusted her with their care, their recovery, their pain management. The addiction devoured money. Every dollar Jim earned went toward bills, toward keeping the household afloat, but it was never enough. The drugs cost more than they could afford. Jennifer's need was insatiable, and so they sank deeper into debt, month after month, struggling to stay above water. Jim, hardworking and honest, must have wondered where the money was going, must have asked questions, sought answers, but the truth remained hidden, buried beneath Jennifer's lies and maneuvering. And there was something else Jennifer was hiding. Someone else. She had started an affair with another man. In the journal she kept, tucked away from Jim's eyes, she wrote about her lover. She described Jim as a good man, but admitted she didn't want to be with him anymore. The words on those pages told the story of a woman trapped, looking for escape, convinced that her happiness lay somewhere else, with someone else. At some point in the months before August 2010, Jennifer took out a life insurance policy on her husband. The death benefit was $250,000. It's unclear exactly when she made the decision, when the thought first crystallized in her mind. Perhaps it came gradually, a dark whisper that grew louder over time. Perhaps it arrived all at once, a terrible solution to problems that felt insurmountable. $250,000, enough to pay off debts, enough to start over, enough to build a new life with her lover, free from the financial pressure that crushed her daily. On the day before Jim died, Jennifer exchanged text messages with her boyfriend. The messages were sexually suggestive. They made plans to meet the next day, a rendezvous, an escape. But first, there was something she needed to do. The last night of August in 2010 was quiet in Lake Crystal. Summer was ending, giving way to the cooler air of autumn. In the house on 176th Street, Jim Nibbe went to bed, exhausted from another day of work. He climbed into bed, closed his eyes, and fell asleep beside his wife. It had rained that night. The gravel roads were soft, the air heavy with moisture. Jennifer knew where Jim kept his shotgun. He had given it to her as a gift, a surprise, never imagining how it might one day be used. She later claimed that voices told her to do it. Voices in her head, compelling her, driving her forward. Whether this was true, whether she truly heard those voices, or whether they were an invention of her defense, no one can say for certain. What is certain is this. In the early morning hours of August 31st, as Jim lay sleeping, Jennifer retrieved the shotgun. She walked to the bedroom. She raised the weapon, and she fired a single shot into the back of her husband's head. The sound must have been deafening in the small house. The finality of it, irreversible. Jim Nibbe died instantly. He was 26 years old. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, the Blue Earth County Sheriff's Department received a 911 call. The caller was frantic, breathless. Jennifer Nibbe. She reported a home invasion. An intruder had broken into her house. She said he had attacked her. He had shot her husband. When deputies arrived at 5127, 5176th Street, they found yellow police tape being strung around the property. The crime scene stretched across the small home. Investigators moving carefully through rooms, documenting everything. Jennifer told the responding officers her story. She had been in the bathroom, she said, brushing her teeth. Or maybe she was in the shower. The details seemed to shift slightly each time she told it. She heard a gunshot, rushed out of the bathroom, found Jim lying in bed, blood pooling around his head, his own rifle beside him. Then the intruder appeared. He was wearing a stocking over his head, Jennifer said, which was why she couldn't describe his face. The gun jammed when he tried to shoot her, she claimed. And instead he grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to the living room, where he bound her with rope. "You're lucky you're not dead," she claimed he told her before fleeing through the back door. Jennifer showed the officers her injuries, cuts on her thighs, bruises on her neck, evidence, she said, of her struggle with the invader. Paramedics transported her to a hospital in Mankato, where she received treatment and was released. Her teenage son, Brady, had been home during the incident. He, too, appeared shaken. The deputies secured the scene and called in the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. This was a homicide, and they would need specialists to process the evidence. From the very beginning, investigators were skeptical. The scene didn't match Jennifer's story. There was no evidence of forced entry. No fresh tire tracks in the soft rain-dampened gravel. No footprints leading away from the house. Nothing had been stolen. There were no signs of a struggle except for the injuries Jennifer herself displayed. Detective Rich Murray and other investigators began to dig deeper. They interviewed neighbors. They examined the house inch by inch. They looked for anything that might corroborate Jennifer's account, and they found contradictions instead. Jennifer told the sheriff she heard the gunshot while in the shower, but she told the deputy she was brushing her teeth. Small details, perhaps, but the kind that raised questions. The crime lab worked through the night, processing evidence, looking for traces of the mysterious intruder. But there was nothing. No DNA. No fingerprints that didn't belong to the family. Meanwhile, the community was on edge. If there was a home invader out there, a killer who broke into houses and shot people in their beds, then everyone was at risk. But Sheriff Brad Peterson made a statement that must have puzzled many residents. He said the department believed this was an isolated incident. There was no risk to public safety. How could he say that if they hadn't caught the killer? Unless, of course, they already knew who the killer was. Over the following days, as Jim's family gathered to mourn, as funeral arrangements were made, investigators continued their work. They discovered Jennifer's journal, hidden away in the house. In its pages, they found confessions of a different sort. Jennifer wrote about her unhappiness in the marriage. She wrote about another man, someone she had feelings for, someone who made her feel alive in ways Jim didn't. They confirmed the affair. Surveillance showed Jennifer going to her lover's apartment shortly after Jim's death. Even as her husband's body was still at the morgue, even as his family wept. They found the forged prescriptions, the stolen medication, the trail of pills that led back to Jennifer's patients to the surgery center where she worked. And they found the life insurance policy, $250,000, taken out on Jim just months before his death. The picture was becoming clear. The financial pressure, the addiction, the affair, the insurance money. The staged home invasion. On September 10th, 2010, just days after Jim's funeral, investigators arrested Jennifer Nibbe outside her office. In custody, Jennifer began to talk. The interrogation room videos would later reveal a woman in crisis, someone who seemed almost relieved to finally unburden herself. She admitted to the drug addiction. The pressure of everything, she said. The finances and the drugs. You live your day for that next fix. She admitted there had been no intruder, no masked man breaking into the house. No struggle except the one inside her own mind. She admitted to shooting Jim in the head as he slept, to cutting her own legs with a knife, to tying herself with rope, to staging the entire scene to look like a home invasion. It was horrible, she told the investigators. Once it happened, I thought, oh my God, what did I do? What did I do? She claimed that voices in her head had compelled her, that she had acted under their influence, driven by something beyond her control. I don't know how I'm going to live with this the rest of my life, she said. I don't know. She was charged with first-degree premeditated murder. Jennifer's defense attorneys requested a psychiatric evaluation. If she had been hearing voices, if she had been mentally unfit at the time of the murder, perhaps she wasn't legally responsible for her actions. But the evaluation found Jennifer competent to stand trial. Mental health experts concluded that despite her drug use, despite the voices she claimed to hear, she had known what she was doing. She had understood the consequences. As the case moved toward trial, the defense shifted strategies. They began to claim that Jennifer had been a victim of domestic abuse, that Jim had physically and sexually assaulted her on a regular basis, sometimes weekly, sometimes more often, that she had developed post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of this abuse, that the murder had been an act of passion, a desperate response to years of trauma, but there was no evidence to support these claims. Jennifer had never filed a police report against Jim. She had never told her family about any abuse. Her journal, where she had written freely about her affair and her unhappiness, made no mention of violence from Jim. In her initial confession to investigators, she had called Jim a good person. Even Jennifer's own father said he had been unaware of any abuse. The prosecution argued that Jennifer was lying, inventing a narrative to avoid responsibility for what she had done. And then came another complication. Jim's autopsy revealed that he had tested positive for HIV and hepatitis. The defense seized on this information, suggesting it supported Jennifer's claims of abuse, though the connection was unclear. Jim's family was devastated. Not only had they lost their brother, their son, their loved one, but now his private medical information was being used to attack his character. His sister Leslie Johnson made a public statement reminding everyone that Jim was not the one on trial. She noted that false positives for HIV and hepatitis are common in post-mortem testing. The family felt re-victimized, their grief compounded by what they saw as an attempt to drag Jim's name through the mud. As the trial date approached, Jennifer's attorneys faced a difficult reality. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Her own confession, the staged crime scene, the life insurance policy, the affair, the lies. In June of 2012, nearly 2 years after Jim's death, Jennifer accepted a plea deal. She would plead guilty to second-degree murder, which carried a lesser sentence than the first-degree charge. In exchange, prosecutors would drop the possibility of life in prison without parole. On July 9th, 2012, Jennifer stood before the judge for sentencing. She received 25 years in prison, with credit for time already served. She would be eligible for parole in approximately 15 years. She was also ordered to pay $11,400 in funeral costs for Jim's burial. To this day, she has not paid a single dollar of that debt. Jim's sister, Leslie, was allowed to give a victim impact statement at the sentencing. She looked at Jennifer and said, "The only tears that you have shed so far have been in court. For yourself. You are not sorry that you took Jim's life. You're only sorry that you told investigators he was a wonderful person that didn't deserve what you did to him." The Nibbe family felt that the sentence was inadequate. 25 years for a premeditated murder. 15 years until possible parole. It didn't seem like justice for Jim, who would never get another day, another hour, another moment. But the legal system had spoken. Jennifer was transferred to the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee, where she began serving her sentence. Her anticipated release date is August 10th, 2027, though it could extend as far as February 2036 depending on her behavior and parole decisions. In 2014, Jim's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Jennifer, seeking over $1 million in damages. The case went to trial, and a jury found that Jennifer had indeed caused Jim's wrongful death. They awarded the Nibbe family $220,000 in compensatory damages. A confidential settlement was reached for the punitive damages portion of the case. As part of that settlement, Jennifer was brought from prison to the courthouse, her feet shackled, to do something she had not done at her criminal sentencing. She apologized. "I would, at this time, like to take responsibility and accountability for my actions," she said, crying. She apologized to Jim's family and to her own family for the pain she had caused. The Nibbe family was granted the right to garnish Jennifer's wages once she is released from prison and begins working. Any money they receive will go toward a scholarship fund established in Jim's name at Lake Crystal Welcome Memorial High School, ensuring that his memory continues to benefit the community he loved. The murder of James Mervin Nibbe is a story that defies simple explanation. It is not a tale of a stranger in the night, of random violence, of chaos descending without warning. It is a story about the person who should have been safest, the person sleeping beside you, the person you trust with your life. Jim Nibbe was by all accounts a good man. He worked hard. He loved the outdoors. He was kind to those around him. He had dreams for the future, plans for the life he was building. And he was killed by the woman he had married, in the bed where he slept, in the home they shared. Jennifer's motivations remain complex. Was it the drugs that drove her to murder, the financial pressure, the affair, the desire for insurance money, or was it, as she sometimes claimed, voices in her head, forces beyond her control? Perhaps it was all of these things, tangled together in a web so dense that even Jennifer herself couldn't fully understand it. What we do know is that addiction is a powerful force, that financial desperation can lead people to unthinkable acts, that secrets, when allowed to fester, can poison everything they touch. We know that Jim's family continues to grieve, that they established a scholarship in his name, that they visit his grave and remember the young man who loved to fish and hunt, who worked with his hands, who smiled easily. We know that Lake Crystal, that small town of 2,500 souls, was forever changed by what happened on 176th Street. That neighbors looked at each other differently afterward. That trust once broken is difficult to rebuild. Let the story settle now. Let it drift away into the darkness as you find your rest. James Mervin Nibbe was born on October 30th, 1983. He died on August 31st, 2010. He was 26 years old. His life was cut short, but he is not forgotten.
His family remembers. His community remembers.
And now you remember too. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the quiet coastal town of Navarre, Florida. A story about a young father, a custody battle, and a tragedy that no one could have imagined. Let the details wash over you as we walk through this case together, slowly and carefully. This is the story of Colby Vinson. The spring air in Navarre was warm that March of 2023. Navarre is a small beach community in Florida's Panhandle. The kind of place where everyone seems to know everyone, where the Gulf of Mexico stretches out endlessly, and where life moves at a gentle pace. Colby Vinson was 24 years old. Those who knew him described him with words that painted a picture of warmth. He had a smile, they said, that could light up a room. His laughter was contagious. He had a passion for his work, a love for loud shoes and tattoos that told stories on his skin. But more than anything else in this world, Colby loved his daughter. Her name was Presley. She was 4 years old with her whole life ahead of her. Colby worked at MUV dispensary, and his co-workers had become like family to him. They watched as he poured everything he had into being a good father. His employer would later say that Colby did everything he could to give his daughter the best life possible. It was clear to everyone around him that this little girl was the center of his universe. But Colby's relationship with Presley's mother, Rachel Moore, had ended some time before. They had been separated for a while, and like many former couples with children, they found themselves navigating the complicated waters of co-parenting. Only their waters were more turbulent than most. For reasons that would later become tragically clear, Colby had not seen his daughter in a year. An entire year had passed without him holding her, reading her bedtime stories, or hearing her laugh. For a father who loved his child more than life itself, that year must have felt like an eternity. So Colby did what any devoted parent would do. He went to court. He fought for his right to be part of his daughter's life. On March 13, 2023, Colby walked into a courtroom in Santa Rosa County. The judge listened to the evidence, considered the arguments, and made a decision that would change everything. Colby was granted 50-50 custody, equal time, equal access, the right to be a father to his little girl. When the news came down, Colby was overjoyed. He immediately sent messages to his friends. The texts were filled with excitement and relief. He had won, after a year of absence. He was going to have his daughter back in his life. His co-worker, Dustin Reynolds, remembered receiving that text. Immediately, Colby's friends started making plans. Barbecues, play dates, getting all the kids together. They could see how much this meant to him. The first visit was scheduled for March 19th, just 6 days after the court's decision. It would be the first time in a full year that Presley would spend time at her father's home. Colby prepared for that day with the care of someone who understood just how precious it would be. He lived at the Cayo Grande Apartments on Navarre Parkway, a modest complex not far from the beach. He wanted everything to be perfect for his daughter's arrival. On the afternoon of March 19th, Colby drove to meet Rachel at a Publix parking lot in Navarre. This was the agreed-upon exchange location. Neutral ground, public, safe. When Presley climbed into her father's car, Colby's heart must have soared. After 365 days, his little girl was with him again. They drove together back to his apartment. Father and daughter reunited at last, but Colby wanted to make sure he had everything they needed for the week ahead. So he loaded Presley back into the car, and they drove to the grocery store together. Just a simple trip to pick up some things for dinner. Breakfast for the morning, snacks that a 4-year-old might enjoy. The ordinary, beautiful routine of parenting. It was early evening when they returned to the Cayo Grande Apartments. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the Florida sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Colby pulled into his parking space in the 7700 block of Navarre Parkway and turned off the engine. His daughter was safe in the back seat. Grocery bags waited in the trunk. His home was just steps away. Everything seemed peaceful, normal. Right. Colby opened his car door and stepped out. He had no way of knowing that someone had been waiting for him. Someone who had driven 5 hours from Colby, Alabama, with murder in his heart. Someone who had been watching, waiting for exactly this moment. To understand what happened to Colby Vinson that evening, we need to step back 6 days, back to March 13th, when a judge made a decision that would set a deadly chain of events in motion. Rachel Moore was 25 years old at the time. She was the mother of Colby's daughter, and for reasons that would later emerge in court, she did not want to share custody of Presley. When the judge ruled that Colby would have equal time with their daughter, Rachel was, according to arrest reports, distraught. That same day, March 13th, Rachel picked up her phone and reached out to someone she trusted, someone she thought could help her with a problem that she couldn't solve on her own, someone she called Booger. His real name was Jason Curtis. He was 53 years old and lived in Cullman, Alabama, about 5 hours north of Navarre. Jason wasn't a blood relative. but he had been part of Reichel's life. He was her former stepfather, her mother Christina's ex-husband. Despite the divorce, he and Reichel had apparently maintained some kind of relationship. What Reichel told Jason Curtis that day would later be revealed through text messages, Facebook Messenger records, and court testimony. She told him about the custody ruling. She told him she had to share her daughter with Colby Vinson. And according to prosecutors, she told him where Colby lived. Jason Curtis's response was chilling. According to testimony from Assistant State Attorney Mark Alderman during Curtis's trial, Jason made a comment about coming down to Florida and hunting Colby down. When Reichel heard this, her response was telling. She wrote back, "Not much hunting. I have an address." Then through Facebook Messenger, Jason Curtis sent Reichel something that should have made her blood run cold. He sent her pictures. Pictures of guns. Pictures of knives. Pictures of a sword. Alongside these images, he wrote a message, "Take your pick." Reichel would later claim that she thanked Curtis for making her feel better. She said she thought he was just trying to comfort her, that she didn't think he would actually do something like this. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Over the course of the next 6 days, from March 13th to March 19th, Reichel Moore and Jason Curtis continued to communicate. The investigation revealed that they were in contact all week. Reichel provided Jason with detailed information about Colby, his physical description, what he looked like, where he lived, where he worked, what kind of car he drove. Everything a hunter would need to find his prey. And Reichel did something else. She gave Jason Curtis $50 for gas money. $50 to make the 5-hour drive from Cullman, Alabama to Navarre, Florida. According to the evidence presented at trial, Jason Curtis began preparing for his trip. He selected his weapon, a .38 caliber Ruger handgun. He wrote down all the information Reichel had given him on a piece of paper, a physical description of Colby Vinson, his vehicle description, his home address, his work address, everything he would need to identify and locate his target. The plan was in motion. March 19th arrived. This was the day that Colby Vinson would take custody of his daughter for the first time in a year. The day that should have been filled with joy and reunion. The day that Reichel Moore and Jason Curtis had been planning for. Curtis climbed into his vehicle in Alabama that morning and began the long drive south. 5 hours through Alabama and into Florida. 5 hours to think about what he was going to do. 5 hours to turn back. He didn't turn back. When he arrived in Santa Rosa County, the license plate cameras captured his vehicle entering the county. He made his way to Navarre Parkway to the Cayo Grande apartments. And then he waited. He waited for Colby Vinson to come home. Evening was settling over Navarre when Colby Vinson's car pulled into the parking lot of the Cayo Grande apartments. It was approximately 9:30 in the evening on March 19th, 2023. Colby parked his car. In the back seat, his 4-year-old daughter Presley sat safely buckled in. In the trunk, grocery bags held the food he'd bought for their week together. The apartment was close, just steps away. Home. Colby opened his car door and stepped out onto the concrete. He moved toward the trunk, perhaps planning to grab the groceries first, or perhaps intending to get his daughter settled inside before carrying in the bags. We'll never know exactly what his plan was. As those next few minutes, what we do know is that Jason Curtis was there, waiting. He had driven 5 hours for this moment. He had a loaded .38 caliber Ruger handgun. He had a piece of paper with Colby's description and address. He had $50 in gas money from Reichel Moore, and he had one purpose. The details of those final moments are preserved in police reports and court testimony, though they are difficult to speak aloud. Colby Vinson came face to face with a stranger. There was no conversation, no warning, no chance to defend himself or even understand what was happening. Jason Curtis raised his weapon and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Colby Vinson in the face. He fell to the concrete just outside his front door, grocery bags still in his car, his entire future erased in less than a second. He was 24 years old. He died there on the ground, outside the home he had prepared for his daughter. And Presley, 4 years old, was still in the car. She saw what happened to her father, or at the very least, she was there, mere feet away when the man she loved more than anything in the world was murdered. The sound of the gunshot must have echoed through the parking lot. Someone called 911. Within minutes, deputies from the Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office were racing toward the Cayo Grande apartments. When they arrived, they found a scene that would haunt them. Colby Vinson lay motionless on the concrete. A gunshot wound to his face, and beside him, sitting right there next to her father's body, was a little girl, 4 years old, unharmed physically, but a witness to something no child should ever see. The deputies secured the scene. They cared for the little girl, making sure she was safe, trying to shield her from the horror of what had just happened. They called for detectives, for crime scene investigators, for everyone who would be needed to piece together what had occurred here. Colby Vinson was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation began immediately. Santa Rosa County Sheriff Bob Johnson would later speak publicly about this case, and his words were filled with anger and disgust. "What a human piece of trash," he said, speaking about the killer. "I mean, to shoot somebody with their 4-year-old child right there. I get up here ad nauseum and tell you about how I'm shocked about how people treat other people. This just goes beyond that. It's horrible." The detectives began working the case that very night. They canvassed the apartment complex looking for witnesses, for security camera footage, for anything that might tell them who had done this and why. They learned quickly that this wasn't a random shooting. This wasn't a robbery. The victim's wallet was still on him. His car was untouched. Nothing was stolen. This was targeted. Someone had come here specifically to kill Colby Vinson. The detectives spoke with the 4-year-old girl's mother, Rachel Moore. She was brought in for questioning, and during that interview, according to the arrest affidavit, she told investigators about her former stepfather, Jason Curtis, whom she called Booger. She admitted that she had told Curtis about losing the custody battle. She said Curtis had sent her pictures of weapons through Facebook Messenger. She claimed she thanked him for making her feel better, but insisted she didn't think he would actually do something like this. She said the conversation looked bad, so she deleted her Facebook Messenger app. Then Rachel told investigators something crucial. She said that on the night of March 19th, around 10 o'clock in the evening, approximately 30 minutes after Colby was shot, Jason Curtis had called her. According to her statement, he told her she didn't have to worry about it anymore. Everything was fine. He had to go. He had to put his ass in the wind. Rachel said that when she spoke to Curtis on that call, he sounded excited. The detectives now had a suspect, Jason Lane Curtis, 53 years old, from Cullman, Alabama. They obtained a warrant for his arrest on charges of first-degree premeditated murder. Law enforcement tracked Curtis's movements. The license plate readers had captured his vehicle entering Santa Rosa County. They tracked him back toward Alabama. On March 21st, 2023, 2 days after the murder, Curtis was arrested in Alabama. When law enforcement searched his vehicle, they found exactly what they were looking for: the murder weapon, the .38 caliber Ruger handgun, and a handwritten note containing Colby Vinson's physical description, his vehicle description, his home address, and his work address. Everything Jason Curtis had needed to hunt down and kill a man he had never met. An empty .38 caliber shell casing was later found at Curtis's home in Alabama, matching the type of ammunition used in the murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The text messages, the Facebook Messenger communications, the license plate camera data, the murder weapon, the handwritten note, the phone call 30 minutes after the shooting, the $50 in gas money. But Jason Curtis wasn't the only one who would face charges. On March 27th, 2023, Rachel Moore was arrested. She was charged with tampering with evidence and accessory after the fact to first-degree murder. The prosecution's theory was clear. Rachel Moore had orchestrated this murder. She had enlisted Jason Curtis. She had provided the information. She had paid for the gas. She had made this happen. But there was one more person who would face charges. At least initially, Christina Moore, Rachel's mother, and Jason Curtis's ex-wife. The prosecution believed that Christina had helped her daughter and Curtis plan the murder. She was charged as an accessory after the fact. However, as the case moved forward, new evidence came to light regarding Christina Moore's involvement. In July of 2025, the Office of the State Attorney was forced to drop the charges against Christina. According to Supervising Assistant State Attorney Greg Marcil, the new evidence made it essentially impossible to prove the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. What that evidence was has never been publicly disclosed. But for Jason Curtis and Rachel Moore, there would be no such reprieve. Their cases moved toward trial. The trial of Jason Curtis began in April of 2024, more than a year after Colby Vinson's murder. Curtis, now 55 years old, sat in the Santa Rosa County Courthouse in Milton, Florida, listening as prosecutors laid out the case against him. Assistant State Attorney Mark Alderman prosecuted the case on behalf of State Attorney Ginger Bowden. Madden. The evidence Alderman presented was methodical, thorough, and damning. The jury heard about the text messages between Raquel Moore and Jason Curtis. They heard about the hunting comments. They saw the pictures of weapons Curtis had sent with the message, "Take your pick." They learned about the $50 in gas money. They saw the handwritten note with Colby's description and addresses. They heard about the license plate cameras that tracked Curtis's vehicle entering and leaving Santa Rosa County during the exact time frame of the murder. They saw the murder weapon that had been found in his vehicle. They heard testimony about the phone call 30 minutes after the shooting, when Curtis told Raquel she had nothing to worry about. Perhaps most powerfully, the jury heard from Colby's family. Brad Minton, Colby's stepfather, addressed Jason Curtis directly in court. His words were filled with grief and fury. "You blew Colby's face off right in front of his little daughter," he said. "How is that helping a baby?" It's not. The defense tried to argue their case, but the evidence was simply too overwhelming. On May 2nd, 2024, after deliberating, the 12-member jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. Circuit Judge Clifton Drake immediately sentenced Jason Curtis to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As required by Florida law, there was no other option for this crime. Curtis was transferred to the Gulf Correctional Institution in Weehawken, Florida, where he remains today, serving his life sentence. But the case wasn't over. Raquel Moore still had to face justice. Her trial took place a year later, in April of 2025. She was now 27 years old, facing charges of first-degree premeditated murder as a principal and tampering with evidence. The prosecution's theory was that even though Jason Curtis had pulled the trigger, Raquel Moore was equally responsible. She had planned it, she had recruited the killer, she had provided the information, she had paid for the trip, she had made it all possible. The evidence against Raquel was much the same as the evidence against Curtis. The text messages, the Facebook communications, the $50, the detailed information she provided about Colby, her admission that she deleted her Facebook Messenger app because it looked bad, the phone call she received 30 minutes after the murder. The jury heard all of it. They deliberated, and on April 24, 2025, they reached their verdict: guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, guilty of tampering with evidence. Judge Clifton Drake, the same judge who had sentenced Jason Curtis, now sentenced Raquel Moore. Like Curtis, she received life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was transferred to the Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida, where she is serving her sentence today. Two people, driven by anger over a custody decision, had destroyed multiple lives. Colby Vinson was dead. A 4-year-old girl had lost her father and witnessed his murder. And two people would spend the rest of their lives in prison. In the wake of Colby Vinson's death, his family and friends struggled to make sense of the senseless. How do you explain to a 4-year-old girl that her father is never coming home? How do you help her process what she witnessed? How do you help her understand that the mother who was supposed to protect her had orchestrated the murder of the father who loved her? Colby's employer, Casey Hardyman, along with other friends and co-workers, worked to establish a trust fund for Presley. They wanted to make sure that Colby's daughter would have support, that she would know her father had been loved, that people cared about her future. The case sparked conversations about custody battles, about the lengths to which some people will go when they feel they're losing control, about the dangers that can lurk beneath even the most ordinary seeming disputes. Sheriff Bob Johnson's words resonated with many people. This went beyond shock. This was truly horrible. But perhaps what's most tragic is how unnecessary it all was. Colby Vinson had gone through the proper channels. He had gone to court. He had followed the law. A judge had determined that it was in the best interest of the child to have time with both parents. This wasn't about an abusive father trying to gain access to a child who needed protection. This was about a loving father who wanted to be part of his daughter's life. Raquel Moore could have accepted the court's ruling. She could have worked with Colby to co-parent their daughter. She could have put aside her own feelings for the sake of her child. But instead, she made a choice that destroyed everything. Jason Curtis could have told Raquel no. When she came to him with her anger and frustration, he could have counseled patience, understanding, acceptance. When the idea of violence arose, he could have refused. He could have warned her against doing anything foolish. Instead, he got in his car and drove 5 hours to commit murder. Their choices rippled outward, touching countless lives. Colby's parents lost their son. His friends lost someone who lit up a room with his smile. His daughter lost her father and gained a trauma that will follow her for the rest of her life. And somewhere in the midst of all this tragedy is a little girl named Presley, who had 2 parents who should have put her first, and instead became the center of a nightmare. The murder of Colby Vinson took place on March 19th, 2023. As of now, Jason Curtis and Rachel Moore are both serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. Christina Moore's charges were dropped due to new evidence that has not been made public. Colby's obituary, written by those who loved him, remembered him as kind, gentle, and loving. It said he had a smile that would light up a room, and laughter that was contagious. It said he loved his daughter more than life. It included a quote from Thomas Campbell: "To live in hearts we leave behind is not to die." Colby Vinson's life was cut short at 24 years old, on what should have been one of the happiest days of his life. The first day in a year that he got to be a father to his daughter again. The first day of what should have been a future filled with barbecues and playdates and watching his little girl grow up. Instead, it was his last day, and somewhere tonight, a little girl is growing up without her father, carrying memories of that March evening that no child should have to carry. This is the story of Colby Vinson, a young man who fought for the right to be a father, who won that right in a court of law, and who was murdered for it by people who believed their anger was more important than his life, or than the well-being of the child they all claimed to love. Take a deep breath. Let this story settle. Remember that in the midst of such darkness, there were people who loved Colby, and who continued to honor his memory. There were co-workers who became friends, who established a fund for his daughter. There were parents who spoke truth in a courtroom. There was a justice system that in the end held his killers accountable. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to explore a story that speaks to the darker corners of human nature. A story of betrayal, manipulation, and a young life cut far too short. This is the story of Brooklyn Sims, an 18-year-old mother from Pensacola, Florida, whose ordinary workday in August of 2023 became the setting for an unthinkable tragedy. Before we begin, I want you to take a deep breath. In and it out. This story contains themes of domestic violence and loss, but we'll move through it together, slowly and carefully. Brooklyn Sims was soft-spoken. Those who knew her often said she had a smile that could light up an entire room. The kind of warmth that made people feel seen, valued, appreciated. At just 18 years old, Brooklyn had already stepped into the most important role of her life. Motherhood. Her daughter Casey was 2 years old in the summer of 2023, a bright-eyed toddler who was Brooklyn's entire world. Brooklyn grew up in the small town of Citronelle, Alabama, a quiet community where everyone knew everyone, where childhood friendships lasted decades, and where family ties ran deep. Her cousin Roxana Robertson would later remember Brooklyn as the life of the party, someone who could walk into a room without saying a word and somehow make everything brighter. Her brother Braylon Carter cherished the way she could make people laugh, the way her mere presence brought joy to those around her. But life, as it often does for young mothers, had thrown Brooklyn into the deep waters of adulthood faster than most. She was navigating single motherhood, working to provide for her daughter, and trying to build a stable life in Pensacola, Florida, about an hour south of her hometown. She had taken a job as a contract employee at the Home Depot on Davis Highway. Honest work, steady hours, a paycheck to help raise Casey. Brooklyn's relationship with Casey's father, Keith G., had been complicated. Keith was 20 years old, 2 years older than Brooklyn, and their relationship had never been easy. Friends and family members would later describe it as rocky, marked by the kind of turbulence that often signals deeper problems beneath the surface. By the summer of 2023, they were no longer together romantically, but they remained connected through their daughter, an arrangement that millions of co-parents navigate every single day. What Brooklyn didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Keith harbored something dark inside him, a rage, a sense of entitlement, a willingness to blame her for things that existed only in his own mind. In early August of 2023, Keith G. received news that would set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. He had visited a medical office and tested positive for a sexually transmitted disease. Rather than process this information rationally, rather than consider the many possible explanations for his diagnosis, Keith's mind went immediately to one person, Brooklyn. He convinced himself, without evidence, without proof, that Brooklyn had given him this infection. In his mind, she had betrayed him. She had wronged him. And in the twisted logic of someone who refuses to accept responsibility for his own actions, Keith decided that Brooklyn deserved to be punished. What Keith didn't know, what he never bothered to verify, was that Brooklyn didn't have any sexually transmitted disease. In fact, she had recently visited her own doctor and received a clean bill of health. On August 5th, just 6 days before her death, Brooklyn had even sent proof of her negative test results to Keith's mother, Sheila I.G., in a text message. The evidence was right there, available to anyone willing to look, that Brooklyn was completely innocent of Keith's accusation. But Keith wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in revenge. And here is where our story takes its most disturbing turn. Because Keith wasn't alone in his plans. The person who should have talked him down, who should have been the voice of reason and maternal wisdom, instead became his co-conspirator. Sheila H., Keith's mother, worked at the same Home Depot where Brooklyn was employed. In fact, Sheila had been instrumental in helping Brooklyn get the job in the first place. She was Brooklyn's team leader, her supervisor, someone Brooklyn trusted. By all accounts, Sheila and Brooklyn had a relationship that went beyond mere co-workers. They had developed a friendship, or at least something that resembled one. But in August of 2023, something changed. The text messages that would later be recovered by investigators paint a chilling picture of a mother who didn't just fail to stop her son from committing murder. She actively encouraged him. The communication between Keith and Sheila A.G. in the days leading up to August 11th reads like something from a nightmare. These weren't the texts of a concerned mother trying to de-escalate a situation. These were the words of someone adding fuel to an already dangerous fire. Keith had reached out to his mother, expressing his anger at Brooklyn, his conviction that she had wronged him. Rather than urge him to seek counseling, to think of his daughter, to consider the consequences, Sheila responded with messages that can only be described as horrifying. In one exchange, Sheila wrote to her son, "If you don't come kill her," UA followed by profanity, essentially calling him a coward. If he didn't follow through with murder, she warned him not to contact his grandmother, knowing that she would try to talk him out of violence. She helped him coordinate the logistics of the attack, discussing when and how it should happen. The messages show a mother and son discussing the deletion of evidence, the covering of tracks, the mechanics of getting away with murder. Sheila told Keith she would let him know when they got close, would tell him where to find Brooklyn in the store, would help ensure the plan succeeded. These weren't heat-of-the-moment texts. These were calculated, deliberate communications between two people planning a homicide. And on the morning of August 11th, 2023, Keith G. put that plan into motion. Keith A.G. started his day like any other, going to work at AMNS Calvert in Mount Vernon, Alabama. But his mind wasn't on his job. He received a call from a medical office, likely confirming his test results, and that call became the trigger he had been waiting for. Keith left work. He went home. He retrieved his firearm, a handgun that he had easy access to, a weapon that would soon claim an innocent life. And then he got into his car and began the 90-minute drive from Alabama to Pensacola, Florida. His destination, the Home Depot on Davis Highway. Meanwhile, Brooklyn Sims arrived at work that morning, with no idea what was coming. She clocked in, put on her work vest, and began her shift alongside her co-workers. It was supposed to be an ordinary Friday. She was probably thinking about the weekend ahead, about picking up Casey, about the simple rhythms of daily life. Sheila AG was also at work that day. Surveillance footage would later show her behaving strangely throughout the morning. She was constantly on her phone, pacing back and forth through the store, checking the front doors again and again. Co-workers noticed her acting odd, distracted, not herself. One witness would later testify that Sheila was ignoring the rest of the staff, lost in her own thoughts or perhaps in her text conversation with her son. For more than an hour, Sheila wandered the store, watching, waiting, communicating with Keith as he made the long drive from Alabama. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Keith's car pulled into the Home Depot parking lot. He parked his vehicle next to his mother's car, a detail that investigators would note later, a sign of the coordination between them. He entered through the main doors, walking with purpose, not browsing, not shopping. He knew exactly where he was going. His mother had told him, "Aisle 52. That's where Brooklyn was working." The co-workers who were nearby would never forget what they witnessed. They saw Keith AG approach Brooklyn in the aisle. They heard him confront her, heard him say those words, "You gave me something." Brooklyn's response was weary, almost exasperated. "Not this again," she said. She had heard this accusation before. Perhaps they had argued about it over the phone. Perhaps she had already told him she was clean, already provided proof, already tried to reason with him. But Keith AG was beyond reason. Brooklyn did what many of us would do when confronted by someone who won't listen. She turned around. She began to walk away from him, attempting to disengage from the conflict, to return to her work, to end the confrontation before it escalated further. Keith would later claim that seeing her turn her back on him, seeing her walk away, made him angrier than he had ever been in his life. In his testimony, he would say that he might not have shot her if she had just stayed and talked to him, if she had just stood there and accepted his accusations, that she walked away. And so he pulled his firearm from his waistband. The sound of gunshots echoed through the Home Depot 7 times. Keith AG fired 7 times at the mother of his child. 7 bullets entered Brooklyn Sims' body as her co-workers screamed and ran for cover. One of those co-workers, Brooklyn's friend Shashank Parnell, was shot in the hand while trying to escape the store, a minor injury compared to the horror unfolding in aisle 52. Brooklyn Sims, 18 years old, collapsed where she stood. She died at the scene, surrounded by the fluorescent lights and orange aprons of a place where she had simply been trying to earn a living. The terror in that store was indescribable. Customers and employees fled in every direction, not knowing if the shooter would continue firing, not knowing if they would be next. The sounds of panic, of crying, of desperate 911 calls filled the air. And Keith AG, his rage finally spent, simply walked out of the store. Keith didn't run far. He got back into his car and drove just a short distance to a restaurant called Mellow Mushroom on Bayou Boulevard. And then, in a move that perhaps suggested some dawning awareness of what he had done, he called 911 and turned himself in. The police arrived and found him waiting. He was arrested without incident, taken into custody, his hands likely still bearing the residue of gunpowder from the weapon he had fired 7 times. Back at the Home Depot, first responders were working frantically, but there was nothing they could do for Brooklyn. She was gone. At just 18 years old, having barely begun her adult life, Brooklyn Sims was dead, killed by someone who claimed to have once cared for her, killed in front of witnesses, killed for something she didn't even do. The investigation began immediately. Detectives secured the scene, interviewed witnesses, pulled surveillance footage, and then they examined Keith's phone. What they found in his text messages was shocking even to seasoned law enforcement officers. The communication between Keith and his mother painted a clear picture of premeditation, of planning, of maternal encouragement toward murder. 3 days after the shooting, on August 14th, deputies arrested Sheila AG in Washington County, Alabama. But the timeline of what she did in those 3 days between the murder and her arrest reveals something particularly disturbing about her character. On the evening of the shooting, hours after her son had murdered Brooklyn in the very store where Sheila worked, Sheila attended a balloon release ceremony in Citronelle, Alabama. Brooklyn's family and friends had gathered to honor her memory, to release purple balloons, Brooklyn's favorite color, into the sky, to mourn together. And Sheila AG was there among them, watching Brooklyn's loved ones grieve. knowing full well what role she had played in creating that grief. Investigators arrested her shortly after she left the vigil. Keith A.G.'s trial began in December of 2023. He took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that often backfires. And this case was no exception. He admitted to everything, admitted to leaving work, admitted to getting his gun, admitted to making the 90-minute drive to Pensacola, admitted to entering the Home Depot, admitted to confronting Brooklyn, admitted to pulling out his weapon and firing 7 times. His defense seemed to rest on the idea that he hadn't planned to kill her when he left Alabama, that the murder was somehow spontaneous, heat of the moment, not premeditated. But the jury didn't buy it. The very act of leaving work, retrieving a firearm, driving 90 minutes to a specific location, and bringing that loaded weapon into a store demonstrated clear intent. The text messages with his mother demonstrated planning. The fact that he knew exactly where to find Brooklyn in the store demonstrated coordination. On December 20th, 2023, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The judge had strong words for Keith during sentencing. He called the case the textbook definition of premeditated murder, noting that Keith had gotten angry and blamed Brooklyn for something that, in disgusting irony, wasn't even her fault. The evidence that Brooklyn didn't have any sexually transmitted disease was entered into the record after the verdict, a final vindication of her innocence that came far too late to save her life. Keith A.G. was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his days behind bars, knowing that he took the life of the mother of his child over a lie he told himself. At sentencing, Keith spoke. He apologized to Brooklyn's family. He said he couldn't ask for forgiveness, couldn't ask them not to hate him. He expressed regret and sorrow, said he thought about Brooklyn every night, said he prayed for their daughter Casey and for Brooklyn. He said he wished he could trade places with her, wished he could reverse the roles. But words, no matter how remorseful, cannot undo murder. Brooklyn's mother, Cornelia Sims, also spoke. August 11th changed my life, she said, her voice heavy with grief. She talked about losing her daughter, about Brooklyn's siblings losing their sister. She said Brooklyn was an auntie, a friend, an amazing child who didn't deserve what happened to her. And then she spoke a truth that cut to the heart of the tragedy. I'm raising his daughter. That day, Casey lost a mother, a father, and a grandmother. Because Casey, just 2 years old when her mother died, lost everyone that day. Her mother was dead. Her father was going to prison forever. And her grandmother, Keith's mother, Sheila, was also facing trial for murder. Sheila G's trial was delayed, rescheduled, and complicated. Her first trial in November of 2024 ended in a mistrial due to issues with the jury. But in August of 2025, she faced a second trial, and this time there would be a resolution. The prosecution presented the text messages, devastating in their clarity. They showed the surveillance footage of Sheila pacing the store for over an hour, constantly on her phone, looking out the front doors repeatedly, positioning herself in a way that some argued was to help her son locate Brooklyn. Sheila's defense attorney argued that she had actually been trying to protect Brooklyn, that she positioned herself as a lookout to shield the young woman from getting shot, that she never truly believed her son would follow through with his threats. He painted Keith as a blustering teenager who was all talk, and suggested that Sheila was simply engaging in the heated communication style that was normal for their relationship. But the jury saw through this argument. The text messages were too explicit, too damning. Telling your son, if you don't come kill her, you a coward, is not the language of someone trying to prevent violence. Providing location updates is not the behavior of someone trying to protect a target. On August 7th, 2025, nearly 2 years after Brooklyn's death, the jury found Sheila A.G. guilty of principal to first-degree premeditated murder. In Florida law, someone who aids or encourages a murder can be charged as a principal, just as guilty as the person who pulled the trigger. Sheila was sentenced to the mandatory minimum, life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the proceedings, Sheila took the stand in her own defense. She testified about her relationship with Brooklyn, claimed she would give up her own life to have Brooklyn back, said she loved Brooklyn and considered her a friend. She admitted to deleting messages out of anger and frustration after the incident. She insisted she never truly believed Keith would harm Brooklyn, but the evidence contradicted her words at every turn. After the verdict, Brooklyn's mother, Cornelia Sims, gave another victim impact statement. She spoke about trying to go on for Casey's sake, about raising her granddaughter, who has now lost so much. "I'll never be the same," she said. But she also spoke with a kind of resilience, noting that Casey was thriving, getting big, looking just like Brooklyn from head to toe. In that moment you could see the dual nature of tragedy. The permanent loss, yes, but also the continuation of life through a child who carries her mother's features, her mother's blood, her mother's legacy. As we near the end of Brooklyn's story, it's worth reflecting on the elements that make this case so particularly disturbing. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a stranger danger scenario. This was intimate partner violence taken to its most extreme conclusion, enabled and encouraged by someone who should have known better. Domestic violence experts often talk about the signs that precede intimate partner homicide. Escalating control, baseless accusations, obsessive behavior, inability to accept the end of a relationship. Keith A.G. displayed many of these warning signs, but Brooklyn may not have recognized them for what they were until it was too late. The involvement of Sheila A.G. adds another layer of tragedy. How does a mother, someone who gave birth to a child, raised them, should want the best for them, encourage that child to commit murder? Some psychologists might point to enmeshment, to unhealthy boundaries between parent and child, to a woman who identified so strongly with her son's grievances that she lost all perspective. Sheila knew Brooklyn. She worked with her every day. She had helped her get the job. By all accounts, they had a relationship. And yet when her son came to her with murder in his heart, she chose to fan those flames rather than douse them. The case also highlights the danger of false accusations in intimate relationships. Keith convinced himself Brooklyn had wronged him without bothering to verify the truth. His ego, his anger, his need to blame someone else for his problems. These became more important than facts, more important than his daughter's well-being, more important than human life itself. And Brooklyn paid the ultimate price for his delusions. In Citronelle, Alabama, Brooklyn's family and friends continue to remember her. They hold her memory close, share stories about her smile, her laughter, the way she loved her daughter with everything she had. Little Casey is being raised by Brooklyn's mother. Cornelia, the girl who lost her mother at just 2 years old, is growing up surrounded by people who loved Brooklyn, who will make sure she knows who her mother was, what she meant to people, how much she wanted to be a good parent. There's a particular cruelty in the fact that Casey will grow up without her mother, without her father, without one grandmother, all because of one act of senseless violence based on a lie. But there's also hope in knowing that she's in the care of people who love her, who will protect her, who will make sure Brooklyn's light continues to shine through her daughter. Brooklyn's story has also become part of the larger conversation about domestic violence, about the importance of recognizing warning signs, about the need for support systems and intervention. Her family has spoken publicly about the importance of women feeling safe to leave dangerous situations, about the need to take threats seriously, about the reality that domestic violence can happen to anyone. On social media and community gatherings, in quiet moments of reflection, people continue to say her name, Brooklyn Sims, 18 years old, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone whose life mattered, whose death was not in vain. If it can help even one person recognize danger and seek help. As we close this chapter, as you settle deeper into your rest, remember that true crime stories aren't just about the darkness. They're also about justice, about communities coming together, about families persevering through unimaginable loss. Keitha G. and Sheila G. will both spend the rest of their lives in prison. Their freedoms stripped away just as they stripped away Brooklyn's future. The justice system, imperfect as it may be, recognized their crimes and ensured accountability. Brooklyn's family continues forward, one day at a time, carrying her memory, raising her daughter, making sure that her story is told not just as a tragedy, but as a reminder of a life that was valuable, precious, worthy of being remembered. Let your mind begin to wander now. Let the details fade. Let sleep come to you gently, knowing that Brooklyn Sims is at peace, that justice has been served, and that her daughter Casey is loved. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, Let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, let me tell you a story. One that happened not so long ago, in a quiet corner of Ireland. Tonight, we're going to journey through the events surrounding the death of Rachel O'Reilly, a young mother whose life was cut short in the most tragic of circumstances. This is a story about love that turned to something darker, about secrets hidden behind closed doors, and about a family's determination to find the truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. Rachel Callie was born on the 10th of October, 1973. She came into this world in Dublin, Ireland, and was adopted by Jim and Rose Callie, a couple who would give her a childhood filled with warmth and love. Rachel grew up surrounded by family, by laughter, by all the ordinary joys of an Irish upbringing in the 1970s and 80s. When Rachel was 14 years old, the Callie family made a bold decision. They packed up their lives and moved all the way to Australia, seeking something new, something different. But the pull of home was strong. After just 1 year, they returned to Ireland. They missed it too much, they said. The green fields, the familiar faces, the place where they truly belonged. Rachel was 17 when she took a part-time job in a local shop. It was there, among the shelves and the cash register, that she met a young man named Joe O'Reilly. He was 19, tall, standing at 6 feet 5 inches, with an easy charm and a way of making people laugh. Rachel was drawn to him. They began dating, and what started as a teenage romance slowly grew into something more serious. In 1994, Joe took Rachel to Paris. At the top of the Eiffel Tower, with the city of lights spread out below them, he asked her to marry him. She said yes. 3 years later, in 1997, Rachel and Joe were married. They honeymooned in Kenya, embarking on what they hoped would be a lifetime of adventures together. For the next few years, they focused on building their careers. Rachel worked for solicitors, handling the careful, detailed work that such a position requires. Joe worked for a software company, part of the growing tech industry that was beginning to flourish in Ireland. In March of 2000, their first son, Luke, was born. The following year, they welcomed Adam. Rachel and Joe now had a family. They bought a home in Lambay-View, Poldarrag, near the village of Knoll in North County Dublin. It was a quiet place, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and children could play outside. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Rachel was a devoted mother. Friends described her as kind, loving, someone who always had time for others. She was tall, standing at 5 feet 11 inches, with a presence that made people notice her. But she was gentle too, the kind of person who cared deeply about those around her. But beneath the surface, the marriage between Rachel and Joe was beginning to fracture. By the early 2000s, cracks were appearing in the O'Reilly household. Joe was working for Viacom, an advertising company, and he traveled frequently for work, or at least that's what he told Rachel. Friends of the couple would later say that the marriage wasn't particularly affectionate. There were arguments, the kind that many couples have, but something felt different here. Something felt off. Rachel began to notice that Joe was distant. He would stay away overnight, claiming he was working late and didn't want to disturb her and the children by coming home. He slept in the spare room when he was home, he said, because they both needed their space. To Rachel's friends, she confided that things weren't right, but she tried to hold it together for the sake of their 2 young sons. What Rachel didn't know was that Joe had been unfaithful, not just once, but multiple times. There had been an affair with a woman named Barbara Hackett, a golfer from Limerick, that had ended about a year before. Joe had told Barbara that his marriage was over in all but name, that he only stayed because he feared losing custody of his sons if he and Rachel divorced. And then there was Nikki Pelly. Nikki was a colleague of Joe's at Viacom. They met at a work function in January of 2004 at a pub called The Barge in Portobello, Dublin. They began exchanging text messages and emails. Innocent at first, just jokes and friendly banter, but by April, the relationship had turned physical. They would meet for lunch at the Tempelog Inn. They went to the movies together. Joe would stay overnight at Nikki's house in Rathfarnham on Tuesday and Saturday nights. Telling Rachel he was working late at the office, Joe introduced Nikki to his sons, taking her to the zoo with Luke and Adam on Saturday afternoons. He introduced her simply as Nikki, nothing more. On one occasion, Nikki even stayed at the O'Reilly family home in Nile while Rachel was away visiting family. Joe told Nikki that he and Rachel had been separated for a year and a half, that they slept in separate bedrooms, that the marriage was effectively over. He spoke of Rachel with contempt, sometimes calling her the wasp or using far harsher language. He told Nikki that he wanted full custody of his sons, that he wouldn't settle for being a weekend parent. Joe and Nikki began planning a future together. They talked about being together permanently. Nikki even had a credit card made with the name Ms. Nikki P. Riley printed on it, a glimpse into the life they imagined they might have. But Rachel was starting to suspect something. Friends whispered to her that Joe never actually had to travel overnight for work. What was he doing on those nights he said he was away? On the 3rd of October, 2004, a Sunday, one of Rachel's sons mentioned Daddy's friend, Nikki. Rachel was furious. Her children knew about this woman. How dare he bring another woman into their lives while they were still married? That night, Rachel and Joe had a heated argument. Joe slept in the spare room. The air between them was thick with unspoken accusations, with anger, with the weight of a marriage falling apart. The next morning, Monday the 4th of October, Joe left the house at 5:30. He said he was going to the gym, then to work. Rachel had her usual routine ahead of her. She would drop Luke at school and Adam at creche, then return home. It was the last morning of her life. The morning of October 4th, 2004, began like any other. Rachel woke, got her boys ready, and drove them to school and creche. CCTV footage from Murphy's Quarry, a location about half a mile from the O'Reilly home, captured her car driving past at 9:03 in the morning, then again at 9:41 as she made her way back home after dropping the children off. But that same CCTV footage captured something else. A car that matched the description of Joe O'Reilly's Fiat Maria was seen passing by the quarry at 9:25, heading in the direction of the O'Reilly home. And then at 9:59, the same type of car was seen heading in the opposite direction, back toward the city. At 9:52 that morning, Joe received a phone call from a friend. The call pinged off the cell tower near Murphy's Quarry, placing Joe's phone in the area of his home at the time Rachel was believed to have been attacked. This contradicted Joe's alibi. He had told investigators he was at work all day, that he had left the office early that morning and gone to meet a colleague, Derek Corney, at the Broadstone bus depot in Dublin. But the phone records told a different story. Joe's phone was near his home when Rachel died. And shortly after, at 10:07 in the morning, Joe sent a text message to Rachel's phone. It read, "You and the boys sleep okay. Wish Jackie happy birthday from us. Please, XXXX." Rachel was likely already dead when that message was sent. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Joe received a phone call from Adam's creche. Rachel hadn't shown up to collect their son. This was unusual. Rachel was always on time. She was a devoted mother who never missed a pickup. Joe tried calling Rachel's mobile, but there was no answer. He left a series of voicemail messages, each one sounding increasingly concerned. In one message, timed at 1:25 in the afternoon, Joe said, "I'm now really worried about you. This is not funny. I'm actually very worried." Then, at 1:45, as he claimed to be driving home from work, he left another message. "Please ring me. I've been crying. You have me worried. If you, talk to me, please." But Joe didn't go straight home. Instead, he called Rachel's mother, Rose Kelly. He asked her to go to the house in Null to check on Rachel. He said he was worried that something might be wrong. Rose, a mother herself, felt a chill run through her. She agreed, and made her way to her daughter's home. When she arrived, the door was unlocked. She stepped inside and immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. The house was in disarray. Drawers were pulled out in the kitchen and sitting room. There was broken glass, overturned furniture, It looked like there had been a break-in. Rose called out for Rachel. There was no answer. She walked further into the house, her heart pounding. And then she saw her. Rachel was lying on the floor of the main bedroom, her body surrounded by a pool of blood. She had been beaten savagely. Her head had sustained multiple blows, her skull fractured in several places. The injuries were so severe that Rose would later describe the scene as something she could never forget. The detective who would later investigate the case said Rachel's hair was matted with blood, that you could see down to her skull through a wound that was about 5 inches long. The force used had been brutal, unrelenting. Rachel had no chance. Rose stood there, frozen in shock and horror. Her daughter was dead. Joe arrived at the house shortly after. He rushed inside, past Rose, who tried to stop him from seeing the scene. When he saw Rachel's body, his first words were strange, almost accusatory. "Rachel, what did you do?" The Gardaí Ireland's police force arrived quickly. They secured the scene and began their investigation. At first glance, it appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. The house had been ransacked. Jewelry and a camcorder had been taken. Rachel's keys were still in her hands, suggesting she had been attacked as soon as she returned home from dropping the boys off. But there were things that didn't add up. There was no sign of forced entry. A large amount of money in Rachel's handbag had been left untouched, and the level of violence used against Rachel was extreme, far beyond what would be expected in a typical burglary. The attack seemed personal, fueled by rage. Detective Inspector Pat Mary, based in Balbriggan, was assigned to lead the investigation. He was an experienced detective, someone who had worked on many complex cases over his career. As he examined the scene and spoke with Rachel's family, he began to develop a theory. This wasn't a random burglary. This was murder, carried out by someone who knew Rachel, and suspicion quickly fell on Joe O'Reilly. Joe's behavior in the days following Rachel's death struck many people as odd. He appeared on television and radio, making public appeals for information about his wife's killer. On October 22nd, just over 2 weeks after Rachel's death, Joe appeared on Ireland's most popular talk show, The Late Late Show. He sat next to Rachel's mother, Rose Kelly, and spoke about the tragedy, asking the public to come forward with any information. But Rose sat there, stiff with anger and suspicion. She already believed that Joe was responsible. She had felt it in her gut from the moment she found her daughter's body. And when Joe spoke on television, he seemed almost to be enjoying the attention. He didn't appear to be grieving. He seemed detached, almost casual. After the show, Joe spent the night at Nicky Pelly's house in Rathfarnham. Rachel's family was horrified. Joe also invited Rose, her husband Jim, and other members of Rachel's family to the house in Knoll. He insisted on giving them what he called the tour. He walked them through the scene of the murder, pointing out the blood splatters on the walls and the floor. He demonstrated how he thought the attack had happened, clenching his fist and striking downward as if he were beating an invisible Rachel lying on the ground. He pointed to the bathroom, saying the killer would have heard Rachel moaning and then came back to finish her off. Rachel's sister-in-law, Denise Kelly, wept as she watched Joe reenact the murder of his wife. Rose, too, was shaken. Who does this? Who brings grieving family members to the scene of a brutal killing and demonstrates how it happened? To the Collies, Joe's behavior was not the behavior of a grieving husband. It was the behavior of someone who knew exactly what had happened, because he had been there. The investigation into Rachel's murder was meticulous. The Gardaí interviewed hundreds of people. They tracked down every owner of a Fiat Maria in Ireland, trying to identify the car that had been seen on CCTV near the O'Reilly home on the morning of the murder. They combed through phone records, examined emails, and pieced together the timeline of October 4th. Joe maintained his innocence. He said he had been at work. He said he had met his colleague Derek Querney at the Broadstone bus depot at around 9 in the morning, then driven to the office. Derek initially supported this alibi, but as the investigation continued, cracks began to appear. Derek admitted to the Gardaí that he might be wrong about the time he saw Joe. He hadn't actually seen Joe until much later in the morning. He had assumed Joe was at the depot because, when he called him, Joe said he was there. But the phone records showed that Joe's phone was nowhere near the depot at that time. It was near the O'Reilly home in Knoll. The Gardaí also discovered Joe's affair with Nicky Pelly. When questioned, Joe initially denied it. He asked Nicky to tell the Gardaí that they were just having an affair, not a relationship. When Nikki later testified, she was asked why Joe made this distinction. She said because if it was a relationship, it would be seen to give him a motive to kill Rachel. Investigators found emails Joe had sent to Nikki and to his sister. In them, he expressed deep resentment toward Rachel. He wrote, "Me, Paul, Rachel marriage over." He said Rachel repulsed him. He fixated on the idea of custody, saying he wouldn't accept being a weekend parent. He had even called social services with false accusations about how Rachel cared for their children, attempting to build a case against her in the event of a divorce. Nikki also revealed something chilling. She told investigators that Joe had once said to her that he would kill Rachel if he knew he could get away with it. At the time, Nikki thought he was joking. She didn't take him seriously, but looking back, those words took on a horrifying new meaning. On the day of the murder, Joe and Nikki had been in frequent contact. Phone records showed that they had spoken 8 times that day. Their first call was at 5:45 in the morning, lasting 27 minutes. They spoke again at various times throughout the morning and afternoon. To investigators, this pattern of communication was significant. It suggested coordination, perhaps even reassurance. The CCTV footage was also crucial. It showed Joe leaving his office at Viacom at 8:07 in the morning. The footage from Murphy's Quarry showed a car matching Joe's Fiat Maria passing by at 9:25, heading toward the O'Reilly home, and then again at 9:59, heading away from it. The timeline fit. Joe had enough time to drive home, attack Rachel, clean himself up, and return to work. Inside the O'Reilly home, Gardaí found evidence that supported this theory. There was blood on the washing machine in the utility room, suggesting that Joe had put his bloodied clothes in the wash before leaving. A shower had been used. Joe had tried to cover his tracks. The jewelry and camcorder that had been taken from the house were later found discarded in the surrounding area. It appeared that Joe had thrown them away to stage the burglary, to make it look like Rachel had been killed by an intruder. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from Rachel's grave. At her funeral, Joe had thrown a note onto her coffin just before it was covered with earth. Rachel's father, Jim, mentioned this to the Gardaí, and they obtained an exhumation order. They dug up Rachel's coffin and retrieved the note. It read, "Rachel, forgive. 2 words, 1 sentence. But I will say them forever." To investigators, this note read like a confession. On October 20th, 2006, more than 2 years after Rachel's death, Joe O'Reilly was arrested and charged with murder. An angry crowd gathered outside Swords District Court as he arrived. When he was formally charged, Joe said he had nothing to say. Joe was remanded in custody at Clover Hill Prison to await trial. The trial began on June 25th, 2007 at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin. It lasted 4 weeks and drew enormous media attention. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, members of the public, and Rachel's family all waiting to hear the evidence. The prosecution, led by Dennis Vaughn Buckley, built their case on circumstantial evidence. There was no murder weapon. The weapon, believed to be a dumbbell or kettlebell, was never found despite extensive searches. There was no DNA evidence directly linking Joe to the crime. Only a small amount of Rachel's blood found on his shoelaces. But the prosecution argued that the totality of the evidence pointed to one conclusion: Joe O'Reilly had killed his wife. They presented the CCTV footage, showing a car matching Joe's near the scene at the time of the murder. They presented the phone records, showing Joe's phone pinging off cell towers near his home when he claimed to be at work. They presented the emails and text messages, showing Joe's hatred for Rachel and his desire to be free of the marriage. They presented testimony from Nikki Pelly, who described the affair and Joe's plans for a future without Rachel. They presented the testimony of Derek Querney, whose alibi for Joe had fallen apart under scrutiny. The defense argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial, that it didn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Joe was guilty. Joe himself claimed that he had been in a state of shock since finding out about Rachel's death, that he had no memory of what happened that day, but the jury was not convinced. After deliberating, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty. Joe O'Reilly was found guilty of the murder of Rachel Callie O'Reilly. He was sentenced to life in prison. As the verdict was read, Rachel's family wept. Rose and Jim Callie cried and hugged each other. Rachel's siblings embraced. Even Detective Inspector Pat Mary, the lead investigator, broke down in tears. He later said he had never witnessed anything like it. The whole court erupted in emotion. Members of the public who had been following the trial cheered. Justice, they felt, had been done. Joe O'Reilly is now serving his life sentence in Wheatfield Prison in Clondalk in Dublin. He has appealed his conviction multiple times, but each appeal has been rejected by the Court of Criminal Appeal. The judges have consistently ruled that there are no grounds to cast doubt on his conviction. Joe has also made applications for temporary release, including a request to be let out for 3 days over Christmas to see his family. Each time his requests have been denied. Rachel's parents, Rose and Jim, have spoken publicly about these applications, expressing their belief that Joe should never be released. Jim has called Joe a dangerous psychopath who gets his kicks out seeing people suffer. Rachel's memory lives on through her family and through the 2 sons she left behind. Rose and Jim have worked to keep Rachel's story alive, participating in documentaries and interviews to ensure that she is remembered, not as a victim, but as the kind, loving person she was. The case of Rachel O'Reilly remains one of Ireland's most notorious murders. It was a landmark case in terms of the evidence used, particularly the phone records and CCTV footage. It was one of the first times in Ireland that such technology played such a central role in securing a conviction based largely on circumstantial evidence. But beyond the legal aspects, it is a story of a family's love and determination. Rose Cowley has said that she felt Rachel spoke to her from beyond the grave, guiding her toward the truth. She trusted her instincts when she suspected Joe, even when others might have doubted her. She fought for justice for her daughter, and she got it. As we come to the end of this story, let's take a moment to reflect. Rachel O'Reilly was 30 years old when she died. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was taken from this world in an act of violence that shocked a nation, but she is remembered. Her story has been told, and her family has ensured that the truth came to light. Joe O'Reilly thought he could get away with murder. He thought he was clever enough to stage a burglary, to create an alibi, to manipulate those around him. But he underestimated the determination of Rachel's family and the skill of the investigators who worked tirelessly to bring him to justice. In the end, the truth emerged. Not immediately, but slowly, piece by piece, until the full picture became clear. Technology played its part. Human intuition played its part. And justice, though it took time, was served. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Rachel. Remember her kindness. Remember her love for her children. Remember that even in the darkest of stories, there can be light. There can be justice. There can be truth. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we'll explore the story of Mary Ellen Samuels, a case that unfolded in the glittering shadow of Hollywood, where dreams and darkness often walk hand in hand. In 1947, a baby girl was born in sunny Southern California. Her name was Mary Ellen Gurnick, and she grew up in the kind of idyllic American childhood that seemed pulled from a movie set. She spent her youth in Santa Ana, going to drive-in movies with friends, making trips to Disneyland with her family, and dancing with boys at local sock hops. She had a normal childhood. Her mother would later testify they loved a pet dog named Patches. Mary Ellen was pretty, very pretty in fact, with a smile that turned heads wherever she went. When we would go out and meet guys, it was always Mary Ellen they would focus on. Her friend Barbara would later remember. Mary Ellen was popular, flirtatious, the kind of girl who could command attention in any room. She was talented too, good enough to land the lead role in her high school drama production, just a block away from her home. A boy named Bob Samuels watched her from afar. He was 2 years younger, too shy to ever approach the beautiful, vivacious Mary Ellen. So he simply admired her from a distance, nursing a crush that would last for years. After high school, Mary Ellen and Bob went their separate ways. Mary Ellen got married, had a daughter named Nicole, and then divorced. Bob pursued his passion for photography and cameras. moving steadily up through the ranks of Hollywood's technical crews. He was diligent, hardworking, quiet, the kind of man who showed up early, did his job exceptionally well, and went home without fanfare. He worked on film after film, eventually becoming a camera operator on major productions. His credits would include The Color Purple, Heaven Can Wait, Lethal Weapon 2, Real Genius, and many others. I worked with Bob for a long time. One of his colleagues would later say, "He's not a player, he was a hard-working guy." So by 1980, Bob had achieved success in Hollywood. And that's when fate brought him face to face with Mary Ellen again. This time, Bob didn't hesitate. The shy boy had grown into a confident man, and Mary Ellen, now divorced with a teenage daughter, seemed like everything he'd ever wanted. They started dating, and within 6 months they were married. Bob started out smitten with her as a young child. The prosecutor would later observe, and was completely enamored of her when he met her again as an adult. At first, everything seemed perfect. Bob and Mary Ellen bought a house in Northridge, in the San Fernando Valley. Bob adopted Mary Ellen's daughter, Nicole, welcoming her into his life with open arms. Friends said he got along great with the teenage girl, treating her as his own. Bob was kind, patient, and generous, continuing to provide for his new family with the steady income from his camera work. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Bob and Mary Ellen were a study in contrasts. Bob was down to earth, content with quiet evenings at home. After long days on set, Mary Ellen, on the other hand, loved excitement. She liked fast cars, sexy clothes, nightclubs, and the glamorous lifestyle she thought marriage to a Hollywood cameraman would provide. When the stars didn't come to dinner parties, when the red carpets didn't roll out for her, Mary Ellen grew restless. She had hoped Bob would provide a star-studded, glamorous life. And instead, she got a hard-working man who operated cameras, not someone who stood in front of them. The marriage began to fray. Mary Ellen started going out to bars and clubs, often taking Nicole with her. Mother and daughter would dress up in what they called their Sunday best and go bar hopping together. An unusual arrangement that raised eyebrows among their friends. Bob, meanwhile, continued working, continued paying the bills, continued hoping things would improve. By 1988, after 6 years of a problematic relationship marked by several separations, Bob bought a condo for Mary Ellen. He hoped that giving her space might help, that she would curtail her partying and care about their relationship again. They lived apart for the next 2 years. But Bob never gave up. He continued to pay for Nicole's private school. He provided Mary Ellen with $1,500 a month in support on top of his other financial contributions. He hoped desperately that the marriage could be saved. But Mary Ellen had other interests. Bob also bought a Subway sandwich shop, which Mary Ellen managed. At least she was supposed to manage it. Often the responsibility fell to Bob himself, who would handle the business even as he worked his demanding Hollywood schedule. Finally, in 1988, Bob accepted what had perhaps been obvious for years. Mary Ellen had no interest in changing. The marriage was over. It had been over for a long time. Bob decided to proceed with a divorce. He met with a lawyer and made plans to drastically cut his financial support. As a divorced man, Bob would owe Mary Ellen around $30,000 as a settlement. The Subway shop would be sold, and they would split the proceeds. Mary Ellen learned of Bob's decision, and something shifted in her mind. She began doing calculations. If Bob divorced her, she would get $30,000. But if Bob died while they were still married, she would inherit everything: $240,000 in life insurance proceeds, $70,000 from the Subway sandwich shop they co-owned, and $160,000 from refinancing their family home. Close to $500,000 total. As one person close to the case would later put it, Mary Ellen realized Bob was worth more to her dead than alive. In 1987, a full year before Bob's death, Mary Ellen began asking people, anyone who would listen, if they could help her kill her husband. She was startlingly open about it. Friends would later testify that she spoke about hiring a hitman while at bars and clubs, seemingly unconcerned about who might overhear. She just didn't seem to care who heard her soliciting his murder. One prosecutor recalled, several people declined her requests. One was a man named David Navarro, who would later become crucial to the investigation. Mary Ellen approached him, but he refused. The task was too dark, too final. But Mary Ellen's daughter Nicole had a boyfriend, a 27-year-old man named James Bernstein. Jim fancied himself something of a wise guy, someone connected to the underworld. He dealt drugs and cultivated a tough persona, and according to court testimony, Nicole told Jim something that made him willing to help. She told him that Bob had molested her when she was a child. She told him that Bob had abused them both. Jim, enraged by these allegations, decided that Bob needed to be taken care of permanently. Investigators would later search through divorce filings and crime reports. They would find no evidence of any abuse charges against Bob Samuels. No reports, no complaints, nothing. Friends and family described Bob as kind and gentle. Not the monster Nicole described, but the story served its purpose. It gave Jim Bernstein a justification for what he was about to do. Jim Bernstein went to his boss at the electronics store where he worked, a man named Charles Mandel, and asked if he knew anyone who could take care of it. Remarkably, Charles gave him the name Mike Silva. Silva, it seemed, was willing to do the job. In November and December of 1988, Jim Bernstein began gathering weapons. He obtained guns, made preparations, and then, on the evening of December 7th, 1988, someone entered Bob Samuels' home in Northridge. Bob was walking toward his tanning bed, wearing almost nothing when he was attacked. First came the blunt force trauma to his head, a violent blow that would have immediately disabled him. Then came the shotgun blast, fired through a pillow to muffle the sound from only inches away. Bob Samuels, 40 years old, died in his hallway. The house was ransacked, made to look like a robbery gone wrong. But there were no signs of forced entry. Nothing of value was actually stolen. It was staged and not particularly well. For a day or two, Bob lay there alone in his house. Then, on the afternoon of December 9th, Mary Ellen Samuels called 911. She told police that she and Nicole had stopped by to drop off their family's pet schnauzer for the weekend. Instead, they found Bob dead. When police arrived, Mary Ellen met them at the door. She wasn't crying, she wasn't hysterical. She was simply there, calm and composed. He had blood coming out of his head, a detective later recalled. The medical examiner would determine Bob had been dead for at least 12 to 24 hours before he was found. A detective, George Daly, was assigned to the case. The crime scene troubled him. While the house looked ransacked, nothing was consistent with a break-in. This appeared to be an inside job. At the police station, Mary Ellen's behavior raised more red flags. She wore a low-cut dress and flirted with the officers. At one point, she put her hand on a detective's bald head and talked about how she liked bald men. Her demeanor was wrong for a grieving widow, too calm, too flirtatious, too unbothered. Within days of Bob's death, Mary Ellen and Nicole moved back into Bob's house. Mary Ellen put the Subway shop up for sale and filed a claim to collect money from Bob's life insurance policy. The investigation was barely underway, and she was already spending his money. Detective Daly visited Mary Ellen at the Subway and asked her to take a polygraph test, just to exclude her as a suspect. She agreed, and surprisingly, she passed. This threw investigators off her trail for a crucial period of time. Meanwhile, Mary Ellen had inherited close to $500,000, and she began spending it with breathtaking speed. She bought herself and Nicole fur coats. She purchased sexy lingerie from a trendy West Hollywood boutique called Trashy Lingerie. She bought custom outfits, high-end leatherware. She got a new boyfriend, a man named Dean Groover, and bought him a white Porsche worth $50,000. She and Dean planned to move to Cancun, Mexico, and Mary Ellen dropped $180,000 on a condo there. She went on vacations, rented limousines, went nightclub hopping. She was spending money faster than most people could earn it. Her behavior earned her a nickname from police and prosecutors, the Green Widow. On one of her trips to Cancun with Dean, he took a photograph that would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in her trial. The photo showed Mary Ellen lying naked on a hotel bed, her body covered with about $20,000 in $100 bills, grinning ear to ear at the camera. "You're rolling in all this money, nude," one juror would later say. "Give me a break." That picture did more damage to her than anything else. For 5 months, the investigation went cold. Then in May of 1989, Detective Daly received an anonymous phone call. The tipster told him to talk to one of Nicole's boyfriends, James Bernstein. The caller also mentioned a man named Mike Silva. Detectives immediately sprang into action. On May 16th, they obtained search warrants for Jim Bernstein's apartment and Bob's house. They brought both Mary Ellen and Jim down to the police station for questioning. Jim was visibly rattled. At one point, detectives put him and Mary Ellen together in the same room. Jim looked at her and said, "He's going to arrest one of us, or both of us right here, right now, tonight, for the murder. He knows 100% that you and I did this," but neither of them confessed. Despite the pressure, despite the fear in Jim's eyes, both held firm. Detectives had to let them go. By this time, Jim Bernstein was terrified. He told his boss at the electronics store, Matt Rao, that he was planning to go to the police and confess everything. "He called me up and said, 'I'm just going to tell the police what I know,'" Matt would later testify, "and that's the last time I talked to him." Jim told other people too. He confessed to his friend Rennie Goldberg that he was feeling remorseful and frightened of being caught. He wanted to confess his involvement in Bob Samuels' murder. He told David Navarro that he and Mike Silva had killed Bob Samuels and that Mary Ellen had paid them for it. On June 26, 1989, Jim told his older brother that he was frightened and that he was the only person who could burn Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen knew Jim was cracking, and she couldn't let that happen. Through her friend Ann Hambley, Mary Ellen met a man named Paul Goll. Paul was Ann's live-in boyfriend, and Ann believed he could help Mary Ellen with her Jim Bernstein problem. Mary Ellen and Paul had several conversations. In the first, Mary Ellen mentioned that she had received insurance money from Bob's death, and that Bernstein was blackmailing her for her involvement in the murder. In subsequent conversations, she repeated this and added details. She wanted Bob killed because he had allegedly abused Nicole, and she wanted the insurance money. She also mentioned a failed earlier attempt to kill Bob. Mary Ellen told Ann Hambley that she wanted Jim Bernstein dead because she thought he would go to the police. Ann suggested that Paul Goll and his friend Darrell Ray Edwards could take care of it. Mary Ellen agreed. On June 27, 1989, Jim Bernstein received a page. He called a number and told David Navarro that he was going to meet Mike Silva, referring to him as the hitman. Jim never came back. Several weeks later, a couple walking along a remote mountain road in Ventura County came across a badly decomposed body. Police arrived and used fingerprints to identify the remains as James Bernstein. He had been strangled to death. Paul Goll and Darrell Ray Edwards had beaten him, strangled him, and dumped his body along the highway. Mary Ellen paid Ann Hambley $6,000 through the subway shop's payroll for the tip about Paul and Darrell. The check would later become evidence. With Jim Bernstein's death, Mary Ellen's drinking buddies and associates began to get scared. They worried about being charged as co-conspirators. They worried that they might be next. People started talking to police. A $1,500 check written around the time Bernstein disappeared led police directly to Paul Goll and Darrell Ray Edwards. When police went to arrest Paul Goll, he immediately confessed. He realized when we went in to get him that it was pretty much over, an investigator recalled. He admitted to his part in it. Paul and Darrell both agreed to testify against Mary Ellen, in exchange for plea deals that would spare them the death penalty. They would each receive sentences of 15 years to life for second-degree murder. The anonymous caller, who had first tipped off police, turned out to be David Navarro, the man Mary Ellen had initially approached to kill Bob. Navarro told detectives everything: how Mary Ellen had tried to recruit him, how Jim Bernstein had confessed to him, how the entire conspiracy had unfolded. On January 26, 1990, police arrived at Mary Ellen's home to arrest her. When they searched the house, they found the infamous photograph of her covered in cash. They also found evidence of her lavish spending receipts, bank records, proof of the $500,000 inheritance disappearing in less than a year. Mary Ellen Samuels' trial began in April of 1994. The prosecution portrayed her as cold, calculating, and consumed by greed. They presented overwhelming evidence. Ann Hambley testified about Mary Ellen's conversations regarding both murders. Paul Goll and Darrell Ray Edwards testified about how Mary Ellen hired them to kill Jim Bernstein. David Navarro testified about Mary Ellen's attempts to recruit him and Jim's later confessions. Phone records showed that Jim Bernstein had called both Mary Ellen and Nicole on the night of Bob's murder. Payroll records from the subway shop showed suspicious payments to Jim Bernstein and to Ann Hambley, neither of whom were employees. The photograph of Mary Ellen, covered in $20,000 in cash, was displayed for the jury. "A picture is worth 1,000 words," the prosecutor said. and this was probably worth 10,000 words. The trial also included testimony about love letters, male strippers, cocaine use, mother-daughter, cheesecake photos, and even a talking parrot that reportedly cursed at the police. It was a circus, a spectacle, but beneath the sensational details was a simple truth. Mary Ellen Samuels had orchestrated 2 murders for money. Mary Ellen's defense was built largely around the claim that Bob had abused Nicole. Nicole herself testified, defying her own lawyer's advice. She claimed Bob had been a drunk who molested her as a child, but investigators had found no evidence of any abuse. Bob's friends and family testified that he didn't drink and wasn't that type of person. Several of Nicole's high school friends testified that Nicole had asked them where she could get a gun to kill her stepfather. Hardly the behavior of someone passively caught up in her mother's schemes. Like mother, like daughter, Bob's sister Susan said bitterly. After all, she is fighting for her mother's life. The jury deliberated for almost 5 days. On July 1st, 1994, they found Mary Ellen Samuels guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, soliciting murder and conspiracy to murder. They also found special circumstances. The murders were committed for financial gain, and there were multiple victims. They recommended death. 2 months later, on September 16th, 1994, Superior Court Judge Michael Huff sentenced Mary Ellen Samuels to death. He described the evidence as overwhelming, extensive, vivid, graphic, and most compelling. The defendant planned the murders for a long time and had the ability to convince others to do her dirty work. Judge Huff said, "The defendant involved many people, even her own teenage daughter." Bob Samuel's sister Susan spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. "He was taken away from us in such a brutal fashion," she said, "and for only one reason, greed. She must now face the consequences of her actions." Mary Ellen Samuels was sent to death row at the Central California Women's Facility. She became one of only 20 women on California's death row. She would remain there for 25 years. In 2005, the California Supreme Court unanimously upheld her death sentence. Then, in December of 2019, the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California reversed her death sentence. The court found that her trial lawyer had provided ineffective representation by failing to object to the prosecution's admission of certain prejudicial evidence. Details about her drug use and provocative photographs that, while sensational, may not have been directly relevant to the murders themselves. The court ruled that, while this evidence likely didn't affect the jury's determination of guilt, the evidence of her involvement was too overwhelming for that. It may have affected their decision between life and death. Her death sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Paul Gall was paroled in 2009, but was returned to custody in 2011 for drug and alcohol abuse. Daryl Ray Edwards was also eventually released. Nicole was never charged with any crime, despite prosecutors considering her an unindicted co-conspirator. As for Mary Ellen, she remains in prison today, now in her late 70s. She has been incarcerated for over 3 decades. The woman who once posed nude covered in $20,000, who spent $500,000 in less than a year, who orchestrated 2 murders to avoid divorce. She spends her days in a cell with no prospect of ever walking free. Bob Samuels had been a quiet man who loved his work. He operated cameras on some of Hollywood's biggest films, worked alongside talented people, and took pride in doing his job well. He had a crush on a beautiful girl from his neighborhood that lasted from childhood into adulthood. When he finally got the chance to marry her, he thought his dreams had come true. But some dreams turn into nightmares. Some love stories end not with happiness, but with shotgun blasts in quiet hallways. Bob Samuels died alone in his house, killed by people hired by the woman he had loved since he was a boy. Jim Bernstein thought he was protecting Nicole from an abuser, but he was manipulated into murder. When his conscience began to trouble him, when he wanted to confess and make things right, he too was murdered, strangled and left on a remote mountain road. 2 lives cut short, families torn apart, all for money that was spent in bars and clubs and Cancun hotel rooms. Money that bought fur coats and porches and condos that Mary Ellen would never get to enjoy. The Green Widow became just another inmate. The photographs that had shown her reveling in blood money became evidence in a trial that would seal her fate. The expensive lingerie and the white Porsche in a dream of a glamorous life in Mexico. All of it disappeared like morning fog in the California sun. In the end, what remains is a story. A cautionary tale about greed, about manipulation, about the lengths some people will go to in pursuit of money, and the consequences that inevitably follow. It's a story that unfolded in the shadow of Hollywood, where Bob Samuels had worked on films that millions would watch, never knowing that his own life would become the subject of a different kind of story. One told in courtrooms and in quiet moments before sleep, a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing tales are the ones that are true. Close your eyes now. Let the story settle in your mind, and sleep, knowing that justice, though sometimes delayed, has a way of finding those who deserve it. The Green Widow sits in her cell. Bob Samuels rests in peace, and the wheels of justice, however slowly they turn, eventually ground out the truth. Good night.